So here's our template and parameter file as exported straight from the portal. As you can see, it's been automatically generated programmatically, which is great and useful, but it does have some weird things in this particular one. So it's very common once you've exported a template to start customizing it to make it your own. So one of the things I see here is if I look at my parameter file, there are 9 parameters in here, most of which I don't think need to be specified. So I want to hard code my SKU to be a free F1 type web app. When it comes to the resource group, then I'm going to have my plan and my web app in the same place, and I shouldn't be specifying things like location and subscription ID. So a lot of these things aren't relevant. Also, if I look at the template itself, then again, I should be able to reduce down those. There's no variables specified at the moment, and we've got some errors coming through for the API version and the website version as well. So I'm going to tidy some of these things up. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move up the scheme and the content version up to the top of the file. Really doesn't matter, to be honest, but it's where I'm used to seeing them, so I'm going to put those back at the top of the file and just make sure they're syntactically good before we start there in the first place. Now, if we go to the aka.ms/armref area again, and we have a look at web apps. So let's have a look at the websites. Then we'll see the API version for that is now up to 2016-0801. So not a lot further on, but we'll just change that to 08 for that. And in doing so, we've got rid of that error there. And looks like that one's okay. Okay, so I'm going to start removing some things which are silly. So things like using a parameter for location. I am very happy to make sure that this goes into the same location as the resource group. There are other times when you might want to specify things differently, but resource group dot location is a very standard thing to put into there. And I'm going to do exactly the same for the other one. / resource group dot location. And for the tier and for the name, let me just shrink up the size of that. Then again, we want to go for a SKU code of F1 and a SKU of free. So our SKU is going to be free. So I'm going to hard code this. So rather than putting in a parameter, I'm just going to say free. And likewise for the name of the SKU code, we're going to go with F1. So that makes that part slightly simpler. One of the other things you'll notice if you have a look at the template format, the new reference, is there's absolutely no reference at all to hosting environment. So we can safely get rid of that as well. Okay. Likewise for the worker size ID, then currently that is set at size ID at 0. So we can do the same with this and again hard code that to 0 there. Okay, so now I've dropped out a few of the variables. Just to clear those up, because you can see they're no longer being used, we can take that set out and remove them. So we've shrunk it down quite a lot already. Now server farm resource group is being used by this very bizarre looking tag. So this is essentially creating a tag called hidden related, and it's giving it a subscriptions, parameter subscription ID, resource groups. Resource group, if you've gone through the theory section, you know that is just a standard resource ID. So why that's not using resource ID to generate that, I don't know. But essentially, we're going to get rid of that whole tag anyway because it's not doing anything for us. And then we've just got the standard dependency at the point. So you should see now that the server farm resource group isn't really doing much for us in different places. So server farm ID, again, we've got this concat here for that too. We're going to change that and make that into a more standard function, which is resource ID. But let's do that using a variable. So let's add in our variable section. And then we can have server farm ID, or as I'm going to put it as web app plan ID. And we're going to have that based on resource ID. Now this is a function you'll be using quite a lot. It's good for generating the resource IDs. It doesn't need to have that existing resource to be able to generate it. It's just essentially generating a string value. but if you hover over it, you can see it takes 4 arguments. We only need 2. We need the name of the resource type and the name of the resource we're going to be generating or linking to. If you don't specify the subscription ID or the resource group name, then it's just going to assume that it's the subscription ID for the resource group you're sitting in, submitting into, and likewise the resource group name, if you're not specified that either. But it does give you the flexibility to generate resource IDs for resources sitting in other resource groups or in other subscriptions. Okay, but for this, we're just going to create one using, for the hosting plan name, the Microsoft Web Server Farms. So that'll be our first string literal. And then the second one we're going to be putting in is going to be the resource name itself. So this will be a variable which doesn't yet exist, which I'm going to be calling web app plan. Okay, so that's good, but as you can see, it's telling us we don't have a variable for that. In fact, it should be variables anyway, because that's not a function name. And then web app plan doesn't exist, which is what we wanted. Okay, so this is when we're going to start creating some additional variables just to make life a little bit simpler. And one of those is going to be our web app plan. So our web app plan is going to be a concat of our parameters. And we're going to have web app within that, or web app name rather. And then I'm going to suffix onto the end of that -plan. So then we only need to specify the brackets and square brackets to close off. We only need to specify the web app name, and it's automatically going to generate that for us. Use the wrong bracket there. So this is now going to become web app name up here instead. So that'll be our string for that. We're not going to have a hosting plan name or hosting environment or server farm resource group or subscription ID. So I'm going to take all of those out, and that will enable us to highlight where they're not being used properly. So the name for our web app should now be web app name. Name is a terrible parameter to use. If you are submitting using Azure ARM commandlets, then one of the things it does is it automatically generates new switches based on your parameters. So if you have one called web app name, it's going to create -web app name, and then you can specify the argument for that to be the name that you want. If you have one called name, it's going to error because that conflicts with name, which is already being used for the name for the deployment job. So why it's generating this with that is a good question. So I'm going to put web app name in at that point. This server farm ID, we no longer need it in that format, so I'm going to get rid of that. We should just be able to specify our new variable, which is web app plan ID. Close that off. And then the hosting environment, as we saw earlier, was blank, so we don't need to specify anything for that. So hosting environment here is a blank value. So I'm just going to take that back to being an empty string. Again, I don't believe that's being used for anything anyway. Let's save that. And then you can see we're now dependent on parameters hosting plan name, which is now instead a variable. And the variable is our web app plan. Finish off the concat. So that's sorted out that resource. Again, for the hosting plan name, this is now our variable's web app plan. Again, we can use the multiple select for this. So again, if I want to get that whole thing removed, then I can do Control F2, delete that, and then we put in variables, and then select web app plan, and then that's gone instead. So then we've got our web app plan, which is being a bit more hard coded into what size it's going to be, but the location is now based off the resource group. And then we have our web app itself, which is dependent on that web app plan implicitly. You can see that dependency there. We've also got an explicit dependency at this level too. This could be using that same web app plan ID. In fact, let's be consistent and do just that rather than just the name. Let's put that resource ID in there. And then that's a much tidier, shorter template for that. Just going to check that we've got, so save that first, check we've got no issues there. We've got one there where I have not closed off the second brace, so that's then gone. Save that. If I look at the parameters file, then we've got a whole host of parameters in here which we're no longer using, so we can get a shot of all of those. Okay, and this one is now changed in terms of the name we've got, so this is now our web app name. So that should be consistent with what's being expected by the template itself. So that's declared that it needs a web app name. That's what's being specified there. It'd be better if I could spell my own name. And that's what it's going to create. So now we've got two that we can use.